In the early 2010s, Austin Jones wasn't just another face on YouTube. He was a rising star. With soft features, blonde hair, and an angelic voice, he embodied a genre of digital innocence. His a cappella covers of popular songs, including Disney and emo anthems, racked up millions of views. His image was squeaky clean, Christian, humble, gentle. A boy who sang from his heart and spoke of self-acceptance, of being kind, and staying strong. He told his young viewers he understood them, that he cared about them, that he was safe. At a time when YouTube was still raw and untamed, Austin carved out a space that felt personal, intimate. He wasn't performing for stadiums. He was singing directly into a webcam, looking his audience in the eye. He spoke softly, often referring to his fans as "my girls," and many believed he saw them as more than followers. To them, he was a friend, a big brother, a crush, a savior from the harshness of the real world. Most of his audience were girls between the ages of 12 and 16. He toured small venues and music festivals, signed autographs, took selfies. He was charming in person, polite, disarming. Parents liked him. Other creators saw him as a wholesome alternative to the growing edginess of YouTube celebrity culture. But behind the lens, Austin Jones was building a private world, one that existed outside of YouTube's algorithm, outside of the meet and greets and the Instagram filters. A world he controlled, one where the girls who adored him were manipulated into thinking they were chosen. It started small. DMs, friendly check-ins, encouragement, compliments. "I noticed you liked my video. That meant so much. You're really beautiful. I bet you don't hear that enough. I think you're special. Do you want to be part of something private?" He would introduce the idea of private messaging, Snapchat, Kik, sometimes email. Then came the auditions. He framed them as a way for fans to prove they were true supporters, that they were worthy of his attention. "I'm starting a project," he'd say. "It's for real fans only. You'd be perfect." What followed was a pattern so calculated it could have been scripted. Austin would ask girls, sometimes as young as 13, to send him videos. At first, they were innocent. A quick hello, maybe a song lyric. But slowly they escalated. He instructed them, reassured them, pressured them. "Do a twerk for me. Just 5 seconds. Say your name. Tell me how old you are. Say this is for Austin. Don't be shy. This is our secret." He exploited their trust, their admiration, their need to be seen. By 2015, Jones had millions of views, a loyal fan base, and a growing network of girls who were confused, manipulated, and silenced by shame. He told them they were helping his career, that they were proving their love, that no one would understand them the way he did. And when they hesitated, he used his platform to guilt them. "I thought you were a real fan. You're going to break my heart. This is just dancing. Everyone does it." He made them feel responsible for his emotions, his art, his pain. Behind closed doors, Jones kept files, organized folders, categorized videos. Some girls sent dozens of clips, others only once. Many were terrified, embarrassed, or didn't know how to say no. He preyed on insecurity, self-doubt, and the adolescent urge to please someone older, more confident, more admired. But outside that dark web of messages and manipulation, cracks were beginning to show. In late 2015, whispers surfaced on Twitter. Anonymous accounts hinted at screenshots. Girls began speaking up, quietly at first. Some shared blurred videos, carefully cropped conversations. But the fandom pushed back. Many refused to believe it. Accusers were bullied, doxxed, and shamed. "How could he?" they asked. "No way. He's not like that." Jones remained silent. He continued uploading, continued touring, continued messaging. But the internet doesn't forget. And in 2017, the whisper became a roar. Screenshots were published. First-person accounts emerged. A journalist compiled testimony from multiple girls, all underage, all pressured into sending Jones explicit dance videos. The term he used again and again. His defense was thin. "I never touched anyone," he insisted in a now-deleted video. "It was all just online. It was never real." But the FBI thought otherwise. That same summer, federal agents knocked on his door. And the truth, long buried beneath filters, harmonies, and rehearsed kindness, finally began to surface. This was not a story about a misunderstood singer. It was the beginning of a story about power, about digital grooming, about a platform that gave a predator direct access to the hearts and homes of children. And it was only the beginning. By the time federal agents launched their formal investigation into Austin Jones in early 2017, the scope of his predatory behavior had already grown beyond what most could have imagined. What began as a trickle of online allegations had become a cascade of screenshots, videos, and stories, all painting a picture of a man who had spent years weaving a web of calculated manipulation behind the polished curtain of online celebrity. The FBI's cybercrimes division moved quietly but methodically. They began interviewing accusers, girls who were now older, some of them just crossing into legal adulthood, others still underage. They came forward, some reluctantly, others defiantly. Most hadn't spoken publicly, not because they didn't want to, but because they were scared of not being believed, of being blamed, of being humiliated again. Their stories were strikingly similar. He messaged them late at night, often commenting on their physical appearance or how supportive they were. He called them his most loyal fans. He used the language of connection and intimacy, words like special, beautiful, chosen. Once trust was established, he made his ask dance for him. Not in private, not at a club, not even in real time, but in a video, a clip, a file they would send him, often while explicitly stating their name and age on camera. The instructions were precise. The victims weren't from the same town. They weren't in the same age bracket. Some lived in major cities, others in rural pockets of the country. But the pattern was identical. Jones, sitting behind his screen in Chicago, had mastered the process. This was grooming at its most modern, digitally facilitated, emotionally disguised, and logistically enabled by platforms that had little oversight. The FBI subpoenaed Google. They traced his email logins, social media IP addresses, and cloud storage history. They found deleted chat logs, hidden folders, encrypted backups. And then, in a corner of his personal drive, they found them, the videos. Dozens of them. He had named the folders. Faves, Core Group, Future Potential. Each one contained dozens of short videos featuring girls between the ages of 12 and 16. Some crying, some laughing awkwardly, some clearly confused about what they were doing. In many of them, Jones' messages could be seen in the background, his encouragements, his instructions, his compliments. But the most damning were the videos where he had told them to identify themselves. Say your name. Say your age. Now say, this is for Austin. Over and over. It was not just immoral. It was illegal. Unquestionably. On June 12, 2017, FBI agents arrested Austin Jones at Chicago O'Hare International Airport as he prepared to board a flight to attend another fan event. He was calm. He said little. When they informed him of the charges, production of child pornography, he nodded and asked to speak with a lawyer. News of the arrest exploded across social media. Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, each lit up with the same shock. Austin Jones? Many fans were horrified. Some were in denial. A few still clung to the hope that there was an explanation. But those who had once spoken up and been silenced felt vindicated. We told you, one girl tweeted. You all bullied us into silence. Look at him now. YouTube immediately suspended his channel. His monetization was revoked. Labels distanced themselves. Promoters pulled his name from every tour banner and event listing. But the damage had been done long before any company moved to act. What disturbed investigators the most wasn't just the number of victims. It was the ease with which he had operated. There were no break-ins, no threats, no violence. Just a phone, a voice, and a level of trust built brick by digital brick. In the courtroom, federal prosecutors laid out their case with grim precision. 2 specific victims, both underage at the time of contact, were named in the initial charges. The videos he'd solicited from them were introduced as exhibits, graphic, undeniable. In his initial appearance, Jones entered a plea of not guilty. He posted bond, returned home, and waited, but he wasn't online anymore. His digital voice, the one that once flooded inboxes and timelines, had gone silent. In private, his lawyers negotiated. The evidence was too overwhelming, the prospect of trial too damaging. And so, in early 2019, Austin Jones stood before a federal judge and changed his plea. Guilty. 2 counts of production of child pornography. The maximum penalty, 40 years. The prosecution pushed for the maximum. They called him manipulative, dangerous, and calculated. The judge agreed with the assessment. Austin Jones was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. For the victims, the sentence felt small. Not because 10 years wasn't serious, but because the pain he had caused could not be measured in time. It had fractured trust, broken families, and scarred dozens of girls who had once seen him as a symbol of comfort. But the conviction marked something else too, a shift, a realization that digital stardom, unchecked, could become something monstrous. That fame, even innocent-seeming fame, could be weaponized in the quiet corners of the internet. And for those girls who once whispered about what he'd done and were ignored, this moment was a declaration. They had not lied. They had not misunderstood. They had survived. But the story didn't end with the prison bars. The real reckoning had just begun, for the platforms, for the culture, and for everyone who let it happen in plain sight. The fall of Austin Jones shocked the public, but for those who truly paid attention to the digital world he built, the signs had been there. They were subtle, hidden in plain sight, embedded in the parasocial relationships between creator and audience, where affection and authority blurred so gradually, so carefully, that by the time something felt off, it was already too late. Jones had crafted his image with surgical precision. His videos were clean, well-lit, and filled with gentle smiles. He never swore. He never pushed controversial opinions. His fan interactions were full of affirmations, often excessively so. "You're so beautiful," he would comment on fan edits. "You have no idea how much this means to me." But while his public presence radiated warmth, the messages behind the scenes revealed an orchestrated campaign of control. The girls he targeted weren't random. They were among the most active followers, commenting on every post, sharing his content, tagging him in their own videos. He would first acknowledge them in public, perhaps a like on a tweet, a heart on a comment. Then a message. "Hey, I saw your edit. It was amazing. Would you want to help me with the project?" The project was always vague. Sometimes he called it a documentary, sometimes a private fan club, sometimes a personal compilation of supporter appreciation. But they all ended the same way, with Jones requesting increasingly suggestive videos. The ask would be framed as empowering. "This is your moment. Show me you're confident. Real fans aren't shy." If a girl hesitated, he turned to guilt. "Do you want me to feel like you don't care? You're making me feel like you don't really support me." To someone outside the fandom, the messages were textbook manipulation. But to a 14-year-old who idolized him, who felt seen in a way school or home never allowed, it was something else. It felt like a test, a challenge, a form of love. The girls didn't just want his approval. They feared losing it, and so they complied. Many of the victims never told anyone. Not their parents, not their friends. Some deleted the videos immediately after sending them. Others cried themselves to sleep, unsure what had just happened, but too afraid to admit it wasn't okay. Jones knew this. He counted on it. But by 2016, as the messages stacked up and the network of victims grew, small cracks in the illusion began to widen. A former fan from Minnesota created a Tumblr post describing her experience. She didn't name Jones directly, but the story was unmistakable. Within hours, it had hundreds of reblogs. A few more girls came forward, anonymously at first, using burner accounts to share screenshots. Then someone did name him, and it went viral. The fandom fractured. There were those who rallied around the accusers, horrified and ready to believe them. But others, deeply entrenched in their belief that Jones was different, fought back viciously. They accused the girls of lying, of seeking attention, of being jealous. Some went as far as threatening them. Jones never addressed the controversy directly. Instead, he posted a short video titled "Taking a Break." In it, he looked somber, tired. He said he was overwhelmed, that the internet had become too toxic, that he needed to step back and reconnect with what really mattered. He didn't mention the accusations. He didn't have to. The damage was already done, but it wasn't yet over. Because while his public silence calmed some, it emboldened others. The girls who had stayed quiet now began to speak. Not just one or two, but dozens. Some had entire folders of messages, time-stamped videos, recorded voice notes. They didn't know each other. They had no reason to coordinate, but their stories were nearly identical. I felt like I owed him. I thought he loved me. I thought I was the only one. One girl, just 13 at the time, described the moment she realized she wasn't special. She had joined a private group chat Jones managed. There, she met another girl, also 13. They both thought they were the only ones he had asked to dance, to record themselves. But then they compared notes. He had sent them the exact same message, word for word. The illusion shattered. That was the moment she went to her mother. That was the moment the FBI was contacted. When the agents finally approached Austin Jones, they already had enough evidence for a warrant. But what they found in his digital devices exceeded their expectations. It wasn't just dozens of videos, it was documentation. Names, ages, notes on who was reliable, who had potential, who was shy but worth pushing. It was industrial-scale exploitation, conducted from the bedroom of a suburban home. His arrest, when it came, felt quiet. There were no flashing sirens, no dramatic foot chases. Just a knock, a badge, and handcuffs. He said nothing. He didn't resist. But in the stillness of that moment, something broke loose in the broader culture. People began asking questions, not just about Jones, but about the entire structure that had allowed him to thrive. About YouTube's lax content monitoring. About how little protection exists for young fans in digital spaces. About how fame, especially the kind that feels personal, can become a weapon. Jones was not the first digital predator, but he was one of the first to fall so publicly, so completely, and with such undeniable evidence. And his story, while horrifying, was no longer unique. It was the beginning of a reckoning, one that would force platforms, parents, and fans to rethink what it means to be safe online, and what dangers can hide behind the gentlest voice on the internet. In the aftermath of Austin Jones' arrest, the spotlight slowly began to shift from the individual to the infrastructure, from the predator to the platform. And what many discovered was not simply a story of one man's manipulation, but of an entire ecosystem built to enable him. An environment where visibility was currency, engagement was loyalty, and where accountability was optional, if not actively avoided. YouTube, the stage that had launched Jones' rise, had no official comment when news of his charges first broke. His videos were quietly demonetized, his channel eventually removed. But the questions didn't go away. How could someone have built a network of exploitation in plain view? Why hadn't red flags been raised by moderators, managers, or fellow creators? The uncomfortable truth: there were no guardrails. At its core, YouTube was designed for growth. Metrics ruled. Subscriber counts, view time, likes, shares. These weren't just statistics. They were the foundation of the platform's business model. And for creators like Jones, that meant there was every incentive to cultivate obsessive fandoms, blur boundaries, and maintain a sense of access that, in hindsight, had become weaponized. Jones wasn't operating in isolation. He was part of a wider trend of accessible idols. Content creators who forged parasocial relationships with viewers, speaking directly into cameras, offering affirmations, sharing intimate details about their lives. It fostered connection, but it also created opportunity for those willing to exploit it. At fan meetups, Jones often insisted on organizing his own VIP sessions. For my most loyal fans, he would say. Parents, seeing a smiling boy with a gentle voice, trusted him. They took photos of their daughters posing with him, never imagining what might be happening in the DMs hours later. And it wasn't just YouTube. Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, each played a role. Each provided Jones with tools to reach his victims without oversight. Some girls were contacted through private stories, others through comments buried under hundreds of interactions. His messages blended in, disguised by charm, camouflaged by clout. One internal investigation by an advocacy group later revealed that several platforms had received user reports related to Jones as early as 2015. Complaints about inappropriate comments, manipulative DMs, grooming language. None were acted on. Most were either ignored or buried beneath automated moderation filters. For creators, speaking out was risky. Many in the community had worked with Jones, toured with him, shared stages and vlogs. Some distanced themselves immediately. Others stayed quiet. A few offered vague statements about being shocked and saddened, but few acknowledged how visible his behavior had been behind closed doors. One female musician later said anonymously, "We all knew he was too close to his fans, too familiar, but no one wanted to be the one to say it, because the fans didn't want to hear it, and the platforms didn't want the drama. It was a silence born not just of fear, but of economics." Jones was profitable. His videos pulled traffic. His name sold tickets. His merch moved quickly. To challenge that meant risking backlash, not just from him, but from the massive digital community that surrounded him. But with his arrest, the walls began to crumble. More creators came forward, not with accusations, but with stories. Stories of warning signs ignored, of uncomfortable interactions dismissed, of whispers that never became words. Meanwhile, journalists dug deeper. They interviewed former moderators, brand managers, agency reps. What emerged was a portrait of systemic neglect. There were no background checks for influencers, no safeguarding protocols, no training in how to spot grooming, manipulation, or coercion in digital spaces. The platforms issued statements, promised reforms. YouTube introduced new reporting tools and filters for underage interactions. Instagram rolled out changes to prevent direct messaging between adults and minors who didn't follow each other. But critics called the measures performative. They knew, one advocate said. They always knew. But they only acted once the headlines became too loud. Jones' fall triggered broader investigations into other creators. A new wave of digital accountability had begun. Fans became more vocal. Parents became more cautious. A movement emerged, pushing for digital literacy programs, youth safety education, and creator accountability codes. But for many, it was too little, too late. Because for every victim who had spoken, dozens remained silent. Out of fear, shame, exhaustion, some had tried to rebuild. Others had vanished from the digital spaces they once loved. In the shadow of the justice system, a cultural reckoning took shape. It wasn't just about Austin Jones. It was about the silence that let him flourish, the screens that made him a star, the platforms that allowed power to go unchecked, and the question no one could yet answer. How many more were out there, hiding in the light? The story was shifting now, not away from Jones, but beyond him, toward the systems, the patterns, the next chapter of a digital world that was finally starting to look in the mirror. Even as Austin Jones sat behind bars, serving a 10-year sentence for the production of child pornography, the echoes of his actions rippled outward, through chat logs, broken communities, and the fractured identities of the fans who once called themselves Jonesies. His arrest had ended the manipulation, but it hadn't erased the damage. What had happened wasn't just a crime. It was a betrayal of trust so deep that it continued to distort the lives of the girls he had targeted. In private Discord servers, old group chats, and now-defunct fan pages, the aftershocks were everywhere. Some former fans turned away from online fandom entirely. They deleted their accounts, wiped their photos, and moved into anonymous corners of the internet where no one knew they'd once idolized him. Others struggled with guilt. How could they have defended him for so long? How could they have ignored the warnings? Then there were those who had sent him videos. One survivor, now in her early 20s, spoke anonymously in a 2021 documentary. "I was 14," she said. "I thought he loved me. I thought I was helping him. I don't even remember who I was before it happened. It changed everything." Her story was one of dozens featured in the film. The production team spent months reaching out to former fans, investigators, and child psychologists to understand the full emotional impact of Jones' crimes. What they uncovered wasn't just about grooming, it was about identity theft. Not of data, but of self. These girls had built their teenage years around a lie, and when it collapsed, it didn't just take down their perception of Jones. It shattered their understanding of themselves. One psychologist described the trauma as slow burn exploitation. Unlike one-time abuse, she explained, what Jones did was drawn out. It was intimate. He made them feel seen, then used that visibility against them. Many of them still struggle with trust, not just in relationships, but in their own judgment. In the years that followed the sentencing, online support groups began to form. Some were organized through nonprofit organizations focused on digital safety. Others emerged quietly through word of mouth. A few were just text chains between girls who had once been in the same private message threads, now reconnecting as survivors instead of fans. They shared screenshots, not just to expose him, those were no longer needed, but to understand how it had happened. "I wanted to see when it changed," one girl said. "When the messages went from sweet to sexual. But now I think they were always both." This reckoning extended beyond victims. Parents, too, began telling their stories. Some admitted they'd once driven their daughters to meet and greets. Took the photo, smiled while Jones signed a shirt or a phone case, completely unaware of what was happening in the background. "I trusted the brand," one mother said. "He was the safe one, the Christian one. I didn't think I needed to worry." Her daughter had sent more than 20 videos. Only one was ever recovered. Teachers and counselors began incorporating lessons on digital boundaries into wellness curriculums. Online safety, once focused primarily on stranger danger, now had to address something more insidious: manipulation by someone you admire. Someone who says the right things, who knows how to make you feel wanted. Meanwhile, the internet evolved. New influencers emerged, some carrying the torch of positive messaging. Others pushed the line even further, testing the limits of what parasocial loyalty could buy them. For every lesson learned, there was a new risk emerging. Because Austin Jones had not created this pattern. He had simply taken it to its inevitable, horrifying conclusion. In some corners of the internet, his name remained taboo. In others, it lingered like a ghost. Old fan videos, compilations of his covers, montages of tour moments, still floated around, sometimes uploaded by third parties, sometimes by fans who hadn't heard the news. YouTube's algorithm occasionally resurfaced archived performances. When it happened, survivors would comment quietly beneath them. "Please take this down. He hurt us. This man is in prison." Most of the time, the videos were removed. Sometimes they weren't. In the quiet, a few survivors began to reclaim their voices more openly. One former fan started a podcast about digital grooming. Another pursued a degree in criminal justice, inspired not by the crime, but by the investigation that followed. Others created art, wrote essays, and spoke at schools. The healing wasn't linear. Some had breakdowns. Some stayed silent. Some never spoke publicly again. But through the pain, a new kind of clarity emerged. They understood now how it had happened, how someone could make you feel chosen, and then use that feeling to turn you into a tool for their own gratification. How the glow of attention can blind you to danger. And most importantly, how none of it was their fault. The fan base that once adored Austin Jones had dissolved. But in its place, a different community had formed, one not based on worship, but on survival, on truth, and on the power of finally being heard. As the dust of Austin Jones' conviction settled into the background of internet history, a darker, less visible pattern persisted. One that had enabled him in the first place, and one that outlived him in countless other spaces. Silence. It wasn't the silence of victims, though that had certainly been present. It was the silence of the system around them. The brands, the platforms, the managers, the fellow creators, the fans who looked the other way, and the adults who trusted without asking questions. It was a culture of willful ignorance and, in many cases, quiet complicity. When Jones had first risen to fame, he wasn't just another singer on YouTube. He represented something for a certain generation of teens, an idealized image of emotional safety. He was the nice guy in a sea of edgier influencers. Parents often pointed to him as the exception. Youth pastors shared his music. School counselors added his content to their wellness playlists. What no one saw or wanted to see was that predators don't always appear dangerous. They don't wear warning signs. They wear smiles. Several former tour staffers later admitted that during his earlier shows, Jones often requested to manage his own VIP lists. He insisted on choosing who came backstage. "It's for the fans," he'd say. He always wanted the underage girls up front. At the time, no one questioned it. A former road manager who spoke under condition of anonymity later said, "I remember thinking it was a little weird, but who was I to judge? He was a pro, polite, never made waves. He prayed before shows." It's the kind of behavior that gets excused when someone is charming. Other creators, too, had seen glimpses of something strange. At house parties, Jones would rarely interact with his peers. He often sat alone, phone in hand, texting endlessly. When asked, he'd say he was talking to fans. "They need me," he would reply. "Some of these girls are suicidal. I'm all they have." That kind of justification was hard to argue with. Who wants to be the person who challenges someone for helping a kid? But behind that savior narrative was a darker reality. Jones had used that very positioning as a shield. By framing himself as emotionally available, he deflected suspicion. And by surrounding himself with messages of purity and kindness, he convinced others to dismiss their instincts. In the months following his sentencing, reporters reached out to booking agencies, venue managers, and online promoters who had worked with him between 2014 and 2017. Most declined to comment. Others claimed ignorance. But a few quietly admitted that something had felt off. He always wanted longer meet-and-greet sessions, one event organizer said. He never said why, but I remember he got frustrated when we tried to limit fan contact. Like really frustrated. Looking back, it chills me. Meanwhile, the YouTube music community largely stayed silent. There were no mass unfollows, no public denouncements. Unlike Hollywood, where a single scandal could create ripples of disassociation, the online creator space was still new to this kind of reckoning. The instinct was not to confront, but to avoid. It was easier to pretend he'd never existed than to examine how deeply he had been integrated into the system. But not everyone stayed quiet. A small group of mid-sized creators, many of them women, began to speak out. They posted videos not just about Jones, but about grooming and fandom culture. They talked about how fan loyalty can be manipulated, about the dangers of unchecked access, about how young people, especially girls, are taught to mistake control for care. One creator, known for her music commentary channel, broke down Jones' entire trajectory in a 40-minute video that reached over 1 million views. She ended it with a simple message. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a system that rewards closeness, discourages boundaries, and turns red flags into engagement metrics. The response was mixed. Some fans thanked her. Others accused her of clout chasing. But the conversation had been forced into the open. More importantly, it reached parents. In parenting forums, Facebook groups, and school newsletters, new discussions were emerging. How do you teach your child the difference between admiration and dependence? How do you protect them not just from strangers, but from the people they think they know best? Advocacy groups began pushing platforms for better tools. Mandatory age filters, creator background checks, verified parental controls. Some were implemented. Many were not. The tension between profit and protection remained. Yet still a shift was beginning, because Austin Jones was not an anomaly. He was a symptom, and while he had been caught, many others had not. Others who watched how he was able to operate. Others who learned from his playbook. But this time, people were paying attention. The silence wasn't as loud anymore. Whispers had become warnings. And the world that once applauded every song without question was starting to ask harder questions. Not just about the predators, but about the culture that made their silence so easy to ignore. While the world outside adjusted to the fallout of his actions, Austin Jones began his life behind bars. In 2019, after receiving a 10-year federal sentence, he was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Seagoville, Texas, a low-security prison known for housing sex offenders and internet-related criminals. For someone who once received screaming ovations on stage and endless praise online, the transition into inmate life was jarring. Jones was no longer the idol, no longer the adored figure. He was inmate #50843-424, just another name on a cell block roster. Upon intake, he underwent standard classification procedures: psychological evaluation, health screenings, and placement into the general population. But even among fellow convicts, his crime carried weight. In prison culture, crimes against children, particularly sexual exploitation, placed offenders at the bottom of the hierarchy. Jones, with his boyish face and history of manipulation, quickly found himself isolated. He spent his first months in near-total silence. Guards later reported he spoke little, mostly kept to himself, and rarely socialized. He spent long hours in the prison library, often flipping through psychology books, legal case files, and music theory texts. Some speculated he was studying for appeals. Others believed he was trying to understand what had gone wrong. But there was no misunderstanding. His crimes were documented in overwhelming detail. His guilt wasn't speculative, it was confessed. Inmates occasionally recognized him. A few approached, curious. Some asked about the YouTube career. Others jeered. "Still got your fans dancing for you, Austin?" One inmate was reported to have said during a lunch shift. The joke wasn't taken lightly. A fight broke out days later. Jones received a disciplinary infraction for disruptive conduct and was placed in solitary confinement for a brief period. When he returned to the general population, his behavior became even more withdrawn. Over time, he began participating in required prison programs. He enrolled in a sex offender treatment initiative, a condition of his sentencing. These sessions, led by licensed therapists, involved group discussions, personal reflection, and written confessions. Jones reportedly struggled. He minimized. He deflected. He rationalized. One counselor's report, later obtained by a journalist via FOIA request, described him as emotionally guarded and intellectually over-rationalizing. It noted that while he acknowledged the harm, he consistently framed his actions as mistakes of connection, not of predation. He believes he was emotionally bonded with these minors, the report read. He does not fully grasp, or is unwilling to admit, the calculated nature of his behavior. That report became a focal point in advocacy circles. It confirmed what many survivors had long said, that Jones didn't see his victims as victims. He saw them as willing participants in his fantasy, not as children groomed into submission. But time does strange things in prison. By 2022, Jones had begun speaking more freely in group therapy. Other inmates noted a change, less defensiveness, more introspection. Whether it was genuine or performative remained unclear. He began tutoring other inmates in music theory, offered to lead chapel services, and participated in a creative writing program. Some staff saw it as growth. Others saw it as a return to image management. What he couldn't escape, however, was the changing world outside. More survivors had come forward. A civil lawsuit had been filed against him, seeking damages for emotional trauma. Online creators continued to dissect his case in podcasts and video essays. And a new generation of content consumers, many of whom had never even heard his name, we're learning about his story not through his music, but through his crimes. In one particularly scathing documentary, a former victim concluded with a warning. Austin Jones might get out one day. He might sing again, but we will always be louder now. He's not the voice anymore. We are. The Bureau of Prisons confirmed that Jones' earliest possible release date, with good behavior, would be in 2028. He would be 36 years old. When asked during a therapy session what he planned to do upon release, Jones answered simply, "I want to help people understand the internet better." Whether that answer came from remorse or reinvention was uncertain. But one thing was clear. The world he left behind, the one that once made him a star, would never be the same when he returned. And it wasn't waiting for him. As 2028 crept closer, whispers began circulating among true crime communities, advocacy groups, and a scattered but watchful online public. Austin Jones was nearing the end of his sentence. For many survivors, it didn't feel like nearly a decade had passed. Their timelines hadn't followed court calendars or prison terms. Their pain didn't operate on fixed release dates. Time, for them, had stretched in complex ways, through anxiety, healing, setbacks, and attempts to reclaim their voices. The news of his impending return brought unease. Some felt fear, others bitterness. A few had buried the trauma deep enough that the thought of his release reopened wounds they thought had long scarred over. Legally, Jones had served his time, but socially, ethically, morally, his debt still felt outstanding. In prison, his conduct had been mostly compliant. Aside from early infractions, Jones had kept his head down. His participation in mandatory treatment programs and vocational training had painted a portrait of someone who, on paper, had adjusted. He earned modest privileges, worked in the prison kitchen, and completed courses in digital literacy and vocational audio engineering. Some prison staff described him as a model inmate. Others remained skeptical. "He knows how to behave," one guard said anonymously. "But he's always performing, always calculating who's watching." The Bureau of Prisons confirmed he would be released to supervised probation. Conditions included mandatory therapy, zero contact with minors, no unsupervised internet use, and the requirement to register as a sex offender in any state he resided. He would not be allowed to perform music professionally, attend meet and greets, or re-enter influencer spaces without legal clearance. Still, rumors flew online. Would he try to make a comeback? Would he speak publicly? Would he deny or deflect? Advocacy organizations issued public statements urging platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram to permanently block him if he attempted to return. Meanwhile, his victims braced themselves. One survivor, now in her mid-20s and working as a therapist, posted a statement on her private blog. It read, "Survivors don't get release dates. We carry our sentences differently. I've spent years unpacking what happened to me. If he's free to move on, then I'm free to speak louder." She wasn't alone. Podcasts began releasing retrospectives. New articles surfaced. Legal experts revisited the case. What emerged wasn't just a profile of a disgraced influencer. It was a map of a broader problem still far from solved. One investigative journalist followed the money trail Jones had built during his peak. Merch sales, ad revenue, digital album royalties. Thousands of dollars still flowed in monthly from content uploaded before his arrest. The article revealed that unless blocked by court order, Jones could legally collect royalties upon release. That discovery led to a new wave of online petitions. Advocacy lawyers began drafting motions to redirect future earnings to a survivor fund. Survivors themselves debated whether they wanted reparations or erasure. "I don't want his money," one said. "I want him off the internet forever." Behind the scenes, probation officers prepared. Jones would be released to a halfway house near Chicago, monitored under strict conditions. He would not be allowed to speak to media without clearance. Every digital interaction would be tracked, every move documented. For a man who once thrived on audience engagement, isolation would now be the norm. And yet, silence didn't mean safety. Digital grooming had evolved. Platforms had learned some lessons, but predators, too, had adapted. Austin Jones was not the last of his kind. He was simply the most visible for a time, and the public, for all its outrage, had a short memory. New influencers emerged weekly. Parasocial bonds remained potent. The cycle, though shaken, continued. In a closed Facebook group for survivors of digital abuse, the message was clear. We're watching. We won't forget. And if he speaks, so will we. As February 2028 drew near, the world stood at the edge of a familiar cliff. Austin Jones would walk out of Seagoville's gates with a duffel bag, a release packet, and a digital legacy that refused to die. Whether he returned to the shadows or tried to reclaim the light, one thing had changed. He would never sing without being heard differently again. And the world, this time, was ready to listen. On February 9, 2028, at exactly 7:05 a.m., Austin Jones walked out of the gates of FCI Seagoville wearing a gray sweatshirt, navy jeans, and state-issued sneakers. His duffel bag, plain, government-issued, and half-empty, swung at his side as he stepped into the cold morning air. A waiting black SUV from the U.S. Probation Office was parked near the curb, its engine running. There were no cameras, no media frenzy, just silence. The moment might have passed without notice if not for a quiet post uploaded hours later to a popular survivor advocacy account. A black square with white text. He's out. The reaction online was instant. Not viral, but sharp, targeted, and informed. Victims privately checked in with each other. Group chats lit up. Podcasts issued short emergency updates. Advocacy groups reshared safety resources for survivors of digital abuse. And YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram were flooded with renewed calls to preemptively block any reentry attempts. For Jones, re-entering the world was not the return of freedom. It was the beginning of a new kind of confinement. His release conditions were strict. He would live in a halfway house for the first 12 months. No social media access. No unsupervised phone or computer use. All internet activity would be monitored by software installed on any device he touched. He was forbidden from speaking to minors, producing or distributing any media content, and required to check in weekly with a federal probation officer. He was also enrolled in a court-mandated reintegration therapy program. In therapy, Jones began meeting weekly with a specialist in digital behavioral addiction and offender recidivism. Reports from the sessions, later obtained through advocacy-requested transparency measures, revealed a man who still saw himself as a cautionary tale, but not yet fully as a perpetrator. I know I hurt people, one session transcript read, but I also think I was sick. I think I got caught in a system that gave me too much access and not enough guidance. It was a theme he returned to often. He spoke less of the victims, more of the system. Less of choice, more of circumstance. He spoke of himself as a lost youth who became an example. The therapist's notes were cautious. There is still a narrative of deflection, one entry stated. Minimal signs of victim-centered accountability. Meanwhile, a group of survivors coordinated an open letter, published by a coalition of advocacy groups. The letter was signed by 24 women who had come forward over the years, some publicly, most anonymously. It called on media platforms to resist sensationalizing his return. It asked the public to remember the actual story, not the man's fall, but the girls he had targeted. It demanded systemic change. He used fame as a weapon. Let us not forget the victims who paid for his platform with their safety. The consequences of his actions didn't end when his sentence did. The letter was shared across major platforms. It trended for nearly 36 hours. Jones, confined by release terms, could not respond. But his name once again rippled through digital culture. By April, the halfway house staff reported Jones had adjusted to routine, but remained introspective and disengaged. He declined media interview requests routed through his legal team. He did not apply for any performance waivers. He took a job cleaning offices for a local nonprofit and commuted under supervision. And yet, small signs of reemergence began to appear. His old Spotify account, abandoned but still active, saw a spike in listens. Playlists began circulating again, some critical, some nostalgic. Old fans, those who hadn't followed the story closely, left comments like, "Missed this voice. He made mistakes but deserves a second chance." Those comments were met swiftly with responses from survivors and supporters. "He groomed minors. These are not mistakes. The voice cost people their childhoods." And then in June, an anonymous YouTube account uploaded a stripped-down instrumental cover, no vocals, just piano. The style matched Jones' tone. The fan speculation exploded. Was he trying to test the waters under an alias? Was this a soft launch? No confirmation came, but the video was removed 2 days later, flagged for content manipulation by community moderators. Probation officials declined to comment on whether Jones was behind the upload. But behind the scenes, one thing was clear: the world hadn't forgotten. And unlike the last time, it wasn't going to wait until harm was done to act. In the quiet tension of 2028, Austin Jones was no longer just a disgraced singer. He was a symbol of unchecked access, of digital manipulation, of a generation betrayed. Whether he tried to rebuild or fade quietly into obscurity, the outcome would no longer be solely in his hands. This time, the audience was watching for all the right reasons. Austin Jones may have been released into a world that no longer welcomed him, but that didn't mean he was gone. Not truly. His digital fingerprints, songs, interviews, videos, and fan-made compilations remained scattered across the internet, remnants of a time when his name had been synonymous with innocence and sincerity. For survivors, that presence was not nostalgic. It was haunting. In the summer of 2028, just months after his release, a coalition of survivor-led organizations launched a new initiative, the Clean Slate Project. Their mission was both technical and symbolic, to scrub the internet of Austin Jones' digital legacy, not to erase history, but to reclaim the space that had once served as a stage for his manipulation. The project began with a list: known URLs, archived fan accounts, playlists, song databases, merch sites. Volunteers combed through every corner of the internet, flagging content, filing takedown requests under digital abuse statutes, and petitioning platforms to de-index his name from search results. Spotify and Apple Music faced increasing pressure to remove his music entirely. But the fight was uphill. While some platforms agreed to cooperate, others hesitated. YouTube, in particular, maintained that content not explicitly violating community standards would remain public, citing freedom of expression. Jones' older videos, those without grooming-related content, were still accessible via mirrors or re-uploads. The algorithm didn't care about ethics. It cared about engagement. Advocates pushed back harder. In a viral open letter published in August, a survivor wrote, "Every time I see his name on a playlist, I feel like I'm being told my pain is entertainment, like my abuse is just background noise." The post was shared over 50,000 times. Hashtag Erase the Echo trended globally. It sparked renewed debate. When, if ever, should the art die with the artist? Especially when the artist's fame was built through the exploitation of others. Survivors weren't the only ones speaking out. Experts in digital trauma, psychologists, and even former employees from the influencer industry joined the conversation. They pointed out that trauma, especially digital trauma, doesn't fade with time. It persists with every reminder, every autoplay, every suggested video. Meanwhile, Jones remained silent. He continued his quiet routine, therapy, work, supervision. He issued no statements, filed no legal motions, did not appeal for reinstatement of his music rights. But some wondered, was this restraint genuine or strategic? By the fall of 2028, the Clean Slate Project had successfully coordinated the removal of over 1,700 videos, 300 social media profiles, and multiple resale sites distributing Jones' merchandise. They began working with legal scholars to create model legislation that would allow survivors of digital abuse to more easily claim takedown rights for content tied to their abuse. For survivors, it was not about vengeance. It was about dignity. One of them, speaking at a conference for digital ethics, said it clearly. We don't want to destroy history. We want control over the pieces of it that destroyed us. At the same time, schools and youth organizations began incorporating the Austin Jones case into broader digital literacy programs. His story became a case study, not just in grooming, but in the cost of misplaced trust, the architecture of parasocial fame, and the responsibility platforms bear when they profit off proximity. Parents, too, started telling their children the story, not as a warning about one man, but about an ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, even silence could echo harm. By the end of the year, streaming numbers for Jones' music had dropped by over 90%. His Spotify artist page was frozen. YouTube's autocomplete no longer brought up his full name. The internet had not forgotten, but it had begun to reshape the narrative. Jones himself remained in the halfway house. There were no public violations of his release terms. But he was no longer just being watched by probation officers. He was being watched by a world that had grown wiser. The fight to forget wasn't about denial. It was about liberation. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, it was survivors, not the singer, who were writing the soundtrack. By early 2029, the question was no longer whether Austin Jones would return to the spotlight. He wouldn't. The question was what society would do with what he left behind. The digital traces, the cultural shifts, the lessons still unsettled. The Clean Slate Project had transformed from a takedown campaign into a full-fledged nonprofit. Its reach extended across continents. Parents, schools, and legal professionals sought guidance. Survivors in unrelated cases began citing it as a model for action. Their website hosted toolkits on identifying grooming behavior, resources for digital self-protection, and templates for legal takedown requests. They even launched an annual symposium, Digital Boundaries in the Age of Influence. The keynote speaker that year wasn't a celebrity or an academic, but a woman in her late 20s. She had once been Jones' favorite. Her testimony had helped build the original FBI case. Now she stood before a crowded conference hall, her voice measured but clear. "He made me believe I was special," she said. "But what I've learned is that I've always been special, because I survived." Her speech went viral. That moment was symbolic, but not isolated. Across the country, and soon the globe, conversations were evolving. No longer reactive, but proactive. Influencer education initiatives emerged in content creator boot camps. Platforms began implementing trauma-informed moderation training. Streaming platforms initiated new clauses that barred profit sharing with convicted predators, even retroactively. Spotify finally removed Jones' entire discography. But not everyone supported the direction things had taken. In online forums, pockets of resistance remained. They claimed censorship. They cited the slippery slope of erasing art. One user in a popular thread titled "Redemption Arc Denied" wrote, "So we're just going to pretend he didn't write good songs? That he didn't matter to people? What happened to forgiveness?" The answer came not in anger, but in volume. Survivors responded with stories. They shared screenshots, descriptions, reflections, not for revenge, but for record, for reclamation. Because what Jones left behind wasn't a discography, it was a network of harm, a roadmap for how manipulation can be scaled through algorithms. And the legacy that mattered now wasn't his. It was theirs. A movement took shape, Echo Guardians. It began as a digital support forum, but grew into a survivor-led intelligence group. Its members tracked patterns of behavior among rising influencers. They flagged parasocial red flags. Creators demanding DMs from underage fans, staging fake breakdowns to encourage emotional loyalty, and love bombing for monetary support. They weren't vigilantes. They didn't dox or harass. They documented, alerted platforms, worked with law enforcement, and they credited their framework to one case, Austin Jones. By the second quarter of 2029, the federal government began hearings on legislation for mandatory influencer background checks for creators monetizing content with underage fan bases. The bill was informally dubbed Jones' Law. Jones himself remained quiet. In the halfway house, he submitted to evaluations, met his curfews, declined interviews. One psychologist's report noted, subject demonstrates external compliance, but exhibits no measurable internal transformation. Remains hyper-focused on personal reputation rather than harm acknowledgement. In a letter filed during a parole review hearing, he wrote, I want to be remembered for more than my mistakes. I want to rebuild, but the court was unmoved. His parole request was denied. The world had moved on, not with cruelty, but with clarity. Not all stories deserve a second verse. Some exist to be remembered, examined, and ultimately left behind. The name Austin Jones had once been whispered like a prayer by teens around the world. Now it was spoken only in caution, because the legacy that endures isn't what the predator creates. It's what the survivors build in its place. And they weren't done building yet. By the end of 2029, the story of Austin Jones no longer belonged to him. It had become something else, something bigger than headlines or sentencing reports. It had become a story about power and silence, trauma and resilience, technology and accountability. And most of all, it had become a monument to what happens when attention is given without protection, when platforms reward intimacy without responsibility. For many, the final chapter had been written the day his parole was denied. But for survivors, the work continued. Not out of vengeance, but purpose. A new generation of advocates was rising, some barely in high school, already fluent in the language of digital safety, consent, and parasocial manipulation. Workshops on online grooming were being taught in classrooms across the US and Europe. Jones' Law passed in 2 states and was gaining momentum federally. Influencer marketing agencies quietly began vetting clients for patterns of fan boundary violations, and contracts were amended to include clauses about parasocial abuse. Meanwhile, a documentary titled Unsubscribed, The Digital Cult of Austin Jones, premiered on a major streaming platform. It was narrated not by a celebrity, but by survivors. Their words framed the story. Their reflections offered closure. One moment in the film lingered with viewers. A montage of the survivors, now adults, each in different stages of life. Some smiling, some still healing, one holding a child, another walking across a university stage, diploma in hand. One of them looked directly into the camera and said, "He told me I'd always belonged to him, that I was his, but I belonged to no one. I never did. I'm free." The moment went viral, not because it was shocking, but because it was true. Across digital spaces, the conversation shifted again, no longer focused on what he did, but what had been done in response. The tools built, the lives rebuilt, the system that, while still imperfect, now knew what it had once failed to see. Austin Jones' name would remain in criminal databases and case studies. He would live out his years under supervision, anonymous to most. His music would fade from public libraries, preserved only in forensic archives and private hard drives. A ghost in the machine that once fed his fame. But the survivors? They became speakers, writers, educators, lawmakers. They started nonprofits, built apps, authored books. One launched a music label for young female artists, its mission rooted in empowerment and ethical mentorship. They weren't just remembered, they became the architects of something better. In a world that had once failed them, they had returned, not as victims, but as visionaries. And in that final note, as the digital echo of his voice was drowned out by theirs, a truth settled quietly, irrevocably. The voice you remember doesn't belong to the one who caused harm. It belongs to the ones who refused to be silenced. They sang louder, and they changed everything.